Writers do describe ships being met by touts of every description. Certainly as sailors walked down the gangplank, it seems they were assailed by offers of almost every description. But among those were those from a German who wanted to buy unusual animals, and this was of course Jamrach. And from this modest and somewhat tenuous grasp on a new land, it seems that his empire expanded to the point where he could begin to commission the collection of larger and more unusual species. Jamrach's aim was obviously to buy and sell animals for profit, but what were the animals and who were his clients? Well, of course, in the days before deep concerns about animal welfare, and also before the establishment of more philanthropic and scientific zoological institutions, there was the menagerie, and in the 19th century the travelling menageries would be the only way that common people could get to see creatures from the far-flung corners of empire. It's not really difficult to understand the amazement of country folk seeing their first ever elephant or camel walking down the street, as illustrated in this picture of a travelling menagerie passing through Gargrave in the Yorkshire Dales. Now, of course, as I've indicated, being a fairly unique thing, an animal importer in Europe, makes you pretty famous. But what was amazing to me was just how famous Jamrach had become. What was perhaps even more amazing to me was the degree to which they were referred to by the world's best-known authors and statesmen of the day. And literary references are many, and include quotations from no less than Charles Dickens, H.G. Wells, Lord Baden Powell. Even Mark Twain mentions Jamrach in his books. In a fictional letter dated 1848 between Charles Dickens' characters, David Crimp and Montague Tigg, who appear in the life and times of Martin Chuzzlewit, Dickens has Montague Tigg asking the question, "The bird, you've been to Jamrachs?" In his autobiography Lessons from the Varsity of Life, Lord Baden Powell, the founder of the Boy Scout movement, wrote about his early life experiences in India and Africa. In India he'd acquired a panther which he named Squirks. In fact, BP almost shot the startled panther, and on discovering that it was a small cub, he took it back home where it lived with him for almost a year. His panther and the puppy that he had apparently got on very well indeed, although the animal was completely wild. Baden Powell refers to it as unreliable, which of course in the talk of empire, the talk of the day, probably meant that it ate some of the servants. As a result of its growing strength and mischievousness, BP says in his book that he passed him on to Jamrach. The First Men in the Moon was one of H.G. Wells' best known books. Written back at the start of the last century, this book is a near perfect example of its era. The book itself is widely regarded as being the birth of science fiction. Now, of course, you'll recall that in the book, the inventor is a lone scientist who develops a spacecraft that can travel to the moon. Along with his eager business partner, Professor Cavor, stocks this wonderful ship and sets off for the moon. The journey itself goes ahead uneventfully, but once they get to the moon, it's very clear that it isn't deserted. In fact, there are natives there who are strange looking to Earth eyes. But Professor Cavor is willing to overlook their appearance, which is very much insect-like, and deal peacefully with them. Regrettably, however, these creatures, called the Selenites, had no wish to deal peacefully with the Earthmen, and continue to hunt them, tracking them down to subterranean caverns beneath the surface of the moon. In one of these caverns, our hero, Bedford, turns to Professor Cavor and says, "Here we are, comfortable as snakes from Jamrachs, loose in a Surbiton villa." The story continues, of course, when Bedford escapes from the Selenites and returns to Earth. And the whole of this was a story of unbridled pace for its day. Published in 1901 at the turn of a new scientific age, the book had a huge impact and is thought to have been the inspiration for the earliest feature film, A Trip to the Moon. H.G. Wells was also famed for his short stories, and in a story entitled The Truth About Pycraft, Wells again refers to Jamrach. The Truth About Pycraft is a story about a man called Mr. Formlin, who makes the acquaintance of Pycroft, who's a very obese man who attends his local gentleman's club. Formalin and Pycroft form a friendship, and Pycroft eventually confesses that he'd like to lose weight. Formalin prepares an elixir prescribed by his Indian grandmother for weight loss. These ingredients include delights such as pariah dog and rattlesnake venom. When asked where the venom came from, Pycroft replies, "I got a rattlesnake from Jamrachs." The Indian elixir is not successful at first, but after a couple of weeks, Mr. Formalin is urgently called to Pycroft's home, where he finds a still very fat Pycroft, who indeed has lost so much weight that he's actually floating round the ceiling. To remedy this, Pycroft lives out the rest of his days wearing lead underpants, a truly cunning way to keep him earthbound. None other than Rudyard Kipling, the Bard of Empire, was also to mention Jamrach in one of his short stories. It was called The Disturber of Traffic, written in 1891. It's a nautical tale of a lone and eventually demented lighthouse keeper whose isolation in the remote Flores Straits slowly sends him mad. He begins to blame the shipping for the white streaks of foam in the sea that speeds one way through the straits and then the other. To prevent the formation of these devilish streaks, the lighthouse keeper decides that instead of guiding the shipping, that he'll misdirect it away from the straits. This leads him to construct buoys and obstacles in the straits to prevent the shipping coming through. In describing a passage through some of these treacherous straits, the story narrator says, "I've come through the Bali Narrows backwards in a monsoon with a south-southwest wind blowing atop of a northerly flood. And our skipper said he wouldn't do it again, not for all of Jamrachs. You've heard of Jamrachs, sir?" Clearly inferred here is that all Jamrachs would have been worth quite a lot of money. It's also fair to assume that the phrase, "not for all Jamrachs," was something of an erstwhile nautical expression, rather like "not for all the tea in China." Mark Twain, perhaps America's greatest literary figure, was it seems also familiar with Jamrach. In chapter 15 of his travelogue, The Equator, A Journey Around the World, Twain details the account given by an employee of the famous circus promoter P.T. Barnum. He describes the encounter between the very flamboyant Barnum and a seemingly more sanguine Charles Jamrach. Twain writes, "The second-class passenger came over as usual at lights out, and we lounged along the spacious, vague solitudes of the deck and smoked the peaceful pipe and talked." He told me of an incident in Mr. Barnum's life which was evidently characteristic of that great showman in several ways. This was Barnum's purchase of Shakespeare's birthplace a quarter of a century before. The second-class passenger was actually in the employ of Charles Jamrach at the time, and Barnum knew Jamrach well. He said the thing began in this way. One morning, Barnum and Jamrach were in Jamrach's little private snuggery, back of the wilderness of caged monkeys and snakes and other commonplaces of Jamrach's stock in trade. Refreshing themselves after an arduous stroke of business, Jamrach with something orthodox, Barnum with something heterodox, for Barnum was a teetotaler. The stroke of business was in the elephant line. In fact, Jamrach had contracted to deliver to Barnum in New York 18 elephants for $360,000 in time for next season's opening. Then it occurred to Mr. Barnum that he needed a card, a trump card, and suggested Jumbo the elephant. Jamrach said that he would have to think of something else. Jumbo couldn't be had. The zoo wouldn't part with that elephant. Barnum said he was willing to pay a fortune for Jumbo if he could get him. Jamrach said it was no use to even think about it, that Jumbo was as popular as the Prince of Wales, and the zoo wouldn't dare to sell him. All England would be outraged at the idea. Jumbo was an English institution. He was part of the national glory. One might as well think of buying Nelson's column. Barnum spoke up with vivacity and said, "That's a first-rate idea. I'll buy Nelson's column too." Jamrach was speechless for a second. Then he said, like one ashamed, "You caught me. I was napping. For a moment I thought you were in earnest." Barnum said pleasantly, "I was in earnest. I know they won't sell it, but no matter. I'll not throw away a good idea for all of that. All I want is a big advertisement. I'll keep the thing in mind, and if nothing better turns up, I'll offer to buy it. That will answer every purpose. It will furnish me with a couple of columns of free advertising in every English and American paper. It will give my show the biggest boom a show ever had in this world." Jamrach started to deliver a burst of admiration, but was interrupted by Barnum, who said, "Here's a state of things. England ought to blush." His eye had fallen on something in the newspaper. He read it through to himself, and then read it out loud, talking about Shakespeare's birthplace being sold by the country. Then Barnum said, "There's my chance. Let Jumbo and Nelson's column alone for the present. They'll keep. I'm going to buy Shakespeare's house. I'll put it in my museum in New York." And that's exactly what he did. As an interesting side note, the Jumbo in question was the original Jumbo, who gave his name to all things huge or jumbo-sized. And it was P.T. Barnum who got his way, buying Jumbo in 1882 to howls of protest from Queen Victoria all the way down to the man in the street. Though it was actually destiny that sealed Jumbo's fate when, after arriving in the US and appearing in Barnum's show, he was subsequently run over by a train and killed in 1885. Jamrach was also to make his appearance in probably the blockbuster novel of the Edwardian age. This was, of course, Bram Stoker's Dracula, which was published in 1897. In the book, when locals start to explain some of the deaths, they blame a wolf called Bazika. And in chapter 11, one of the locals tells Van Helsing, "All right, Governor, this here's about the old story. That there wolf that we call Bazika was one of 3 grey ones that came from Norway to Jamrachs. We bought it off him 4 years ago. He was a nice, well-behaved wolf that never gave no trouble to talk of. I'm more surprised at him for wanting to get out than for any other animal in the place. But there, you can't trust wolves no more than you can trust women." Not all literary references are as grand, however, and one of the lesser-known authors who refers to Jamrach is Harold Finch Hatton. Finch Hatton, an original native of Lincolnshire, travelled to Australia to make his fortune as a gold miner. This was an enterprise that subsequently failed. But it did lead him into politics. Prior to this, however, he travelled somewhat aimlessly around Queensland, New South Wales and Victoria. His book, Advance Australia, is an account of these travels published in 1885, and in chapter 3 Finch Hatton writes, "At one bend in the river, just at the head of a deep pool where the scrub on the banks was very thick, my brother said there was pretty sure to be an alligator, and if we went quietly we might get a sight of it. So we got off, hung our horses to a tree, and crawled through the scrub down the bank to the water's edge. Peering cautiously through the tangled curtain of creepers that hung over the water, we were rewarded by the sight of a huge alligator, basking on a sandbank about 60 yards off, and apparently fast asleep. The instant we showed ourselves, however, he shuffled in the water with incredible speed. The upper waters of the Pioneer are inhabited by numbers of these brutes, and some of them grow to be an enormous size. One was killed not long before I arrived, 19 feet long, but even this was eclipsed by Big Ben of the Fitzroy River, who measured 23 feet 6 inches, and who, when I last saw him, was in the possession of Mr. Jamrach in London." Other lesser-known literary dispatches include those from authors such as Eliza Brightwen. In her book, Wild Nature Won by Kindness, she expresses a sense of disappointment after having waited a very long time to visit Jamrachs for the first time. After driving through a labyrinth of narrow, dirty streets, she was obliged to walk the last stage until she came to Jamrach's shop. There she found an ear-piercing chorus from cockatoos, macaws and parrots. Charles Jamrach showed her armadillos, which she regarded to be not attractive as pets, as one could not fondle a thing composed of metal plates, shaped like a pig, and with a tendency to roll itself up into a ball on the slightest provocation. Jamrach, who was clearly a man after my own heart, or perhaps more properly, a man before my heart, responded that if Eliza got tired of it as a pet, she could at least have it cooked, as they made excellent eating.